Hey, fifth graders. All right, so this is the last lesson for Unit 5. That makes it lesson 7. Lesson 7 is what it is. So you guys should have done lesson 6 yesterday, or at some point before this video. Anyway, you should have done lesson 6. So I've got the little worksheet here. Number one, you can tell from the political cartoon that some Americans thought Andrew Jackson was behaving like, well, if you look at that cartoon there, he clearly looks like he's behaving like a D, king, is what it should be. The Indian Removal Act forced Native Americans on a journey known as, that would be C, the Trail of Tears. Which of the following did immigrants hope to find in the United States? Well, if you read through those, A is discrimination, B is starvation, and C is poor housing. All of those things sound pretty terrible, so hoping to find them is not what they wanted, though many of them probably did find those things, which is unfortunate. However, what they really wanted to find was work. Number four, how did the Cherokee fight the Indian Removal Act? They sued the U.S. government, and the courts agreed with them, but unfortunately, Andrew Jackson didn't care because that was Andrew Jackson. He just didn't care. So they sued. They took it to court, and they won, but they still lost. Describe conditions for free blacks in northern cities. Basically, the conditions were very poor. They still were being, treated. There was prejudices against them. People were racist towards them. They also, let's see, what else did the book say? Those are the big ones, of course. There was segregation. They couldn't go into certain buildings, and they didn't have water fountains back then. But if they had water fountains, they wouldn't have been allowed to use the same water fountains that white people used. It was, all the things that went all the way through until the 1960s. Those were all happening back then as well. So for the vocabulary on the back, in the United States, the states are joined together in a union is the first one. Number two, the idea of blank encouraged pioneers to settle the West. That was manifest destiny. That was the idea that God had divinely ordained that the United States should stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Number three, pioneers traveled in a blank to protect themselves. That's a wagon train. Number four, President Jackson and the U.S. Army forced the Cherokee to go on the Trail of Tears is number four, Trail of Tears. And number five, people face discrimination when they are treated unfairly, usually because of their race. So discrimination would be number five. Okay, so that gets you through that. So now we are on to, that was lesson 6. Now we're on to lesson 7. And so this is going to talk, we have kind of a lot of stuff that happens here. I'll try to get through it all pretty quickly. So first of all, in 1821, Mexico gains its independence from Spain. Their territory at this time stretches up into what is today the southwestern part of the United States. So Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Wyoming, Utah, all of those, and Nevada, all of those states are what are now states, but at the time, those were all Mexican territory. However, not a lot of Mexican people actually lived there. And so what they decided to do was they decided to basically give land to Americans who were willing to move out because the Americans were pushing west. And so they said, hey, if you'll come live here and settle this area, you can be Mexican citizens and we'll give you free land. And so there was a lot of Americans who took them up on that. In particular, a man named Moses Austin and his son Steve took that up. Mexico gave them 18,000 acres of land, and then they turned around and they sold that to a whole bunch of different families, bringing in something like 7,000 Americans eventually. And the Mexican government starts to get a little bit nervous about this. In particular, by 1835, there's now like 25,000 Americans living in the Texas area. So they get nervous and they basically say, hey, we're going to annul our contract, in particular with Moses Austin, but with everybody pretty much. Also, Americans, slavery was illegal in Mexico. I imagine at least partly because Mexico had been controlled by Spain and a lot of their native population was treated as slaves. So they probably felt pretty negatively towards slavery. So basically, in Texas, you were not supposed to have slaves. However, they just kind of didn't enforce that rule when it came to the Americans. They let the Americans bring in slaves. Um, Now, when they get nervous, they start saying, no, you can't do that. You can't do this. You can't do that. All these things that we've been letting you guys get away with, we're not going to let you get away with anymore. And so the Americans don't like this. They don't want to be Mexican citizens, and they definitely want to have slavery because they kind of depend on it with their cotton farms and things like that, and just the fact that it's free labor, which it's reprehensible to us, but to them it was like, no, this is the way that we do things. So they basically they decide that they don't want to like follow Mexico's rules. They want to have autonomy. They're not necessarily saying that they want Texas to be independent, though probably a lot of them do. There's also a lot of I think they're called Tejanos. Tejanos. I'm not quite sure if I'm saying it right. But basically, these are Mexican people who are living in Texas, and a lot of them, in particular the elites, so the rich ones, quite a few of them side with the Americans on this issue, and they start selling Mexico that they want to have more autonomy. They want to be not necessarily independent, but they want to be allowed to make their own rules in Texas. And so Mexico responds by sending General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and he is going to use his army essentially to force everybody to obey the rules. And what happens here is that this causes. Sorry, I'm going to scoot this over so it's a little more stable. Hopefully, I noticed that it's been bouncing. Anyway, this causes this basically this call for autonomy. It turns it into essentially a revolution. So Texas decides that they're going to break away from Mexico. And in December of 1835, this independent Texan movement essentially captures the town of San Antonio. Today, San Antonio, of course, is a city. Back then, it was much, much smaller. And they take control of a former Spanish mission called the Alamo that had been converted into a fort. They take control of this fort. In basically March of 1836, Santa Anna's army gets to San Antonio, and they basically they kind of surround, in particular, the Alamo. A lot of the Texans have retreated into this building, and they're kind of using it as their base. And Santa Anna's army, after 2 weeks, I think it was actually like 13 days, but about 2 weeks of some fighting, but then they really make a big push into the Alamo. There's a lot of people there, but in particular, probably one of the most famous ones is Davy Crockett, who was a guy who wore a coonskin cap. He was a pioneer. He's kind of almost become like a mythological figure in American history. But Davy Crockett was at the Alamo. March 6th is the day that Santa Anna's army is going to recapture the Alamo. Supposedly on March 5th, the leader, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but he basically tells people, hey, there's an imminent attack. If you want to leave, you can. There's a lot of like kind of myths and legends about, he drew a line in the sand and said, like, if you're willing to stay and fight for our independence, then cross the line. And like one person didn't or something. But regardless, there was a guy who was sent out on March 5th to basically take a request for reinforcements to the Texas government. And so that guy, I think, is probably the last person to get out. I don't remember what his name is off the top of my head either, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, so reinforcements do not arrive. Santa Anna's army recaptures the Alamo. It gets to the point where like the Americans who are fighting back don't even have time to reload, so they just turn their rifles around and their muskets around and are using them as clubs. There's some pretty brutal fighting. The Mexicans are feeling not very charitable towards the Americans, so they kill everybody. All the men who were in there who were fighting get killed, and even if it's like basically the fighting is over, and these guys are, some of them obviously they'd been wounded, they were very injured, they could not possibly fight back, and the Mexican soldiers were still going through and stabbing them with bayonets or shooting them. And there were women and children who were in the Alamo. And so consequently, like, news about what happens here gets out. The Mexican army was so incensed by this whole battle thing that, like, it took forever. Even after the fighting was done, Mexican soldiers were still shooting into the Alamo, even though their own soldiers were in there. So all the Americans are dead, and or all the Texans, I guess we'd call them, are dead, and several Mexicans are still killed by their own men who are just firing like indiscriminately at anything that moves. So it's kind of this crazy, crazy battle. But everybody dies. All the Texans / Americans die. And so this information gets back to the Texas government, and General Sam Houston is sent with his army, and he eventually gets down there, and he comes across or finds Santa Anna's army, and the Texans at this point are outnumbered 6-1. There are 6 Mexican soldiers for every 1 Texan soldier. However, the whole Alamo thing really makes a lot of people mad. It's kind of the Boston Massacre of this Texas independent movement. You know, like, it was a thing that happened, and it maybe got blown out of proportion, but certainly it was kind of a black eye, and a lot of people were really offended by it who were living there, who maybe are on the fence. All of a sudden, they're like, no, we're going to join the Texans and we're going to fight for independence. And so Sam Houston's army gets bigger. It still is massively outnumbered by Santa Anna's army. However, Santa Anna thinks that because his army is so much bigger than the Texans or the Americans, that they're just going to surrender to him, and that's not what happens. And so consequently, Sam Houston's army attacks, and they, in like 18 minutes, defeat Santa Anna's army, and they capture Santa Anna. They don't kill him. In fact, they make him order a retreat from Texas of all of his soldiers, which kind of is supposed to like add some legitimacy to this Texas independent movement. So Texas has essentially won their independence. They initially become their own country, so they are the Lone Star Republic, and then they want to become a state of the United States, because a lot of the people who are living there at this point are American citizens, and so they apply to be a state. But there's a bit of a problem. First of all, the United States is maybe a little bit not nervous, but they don't really want to have a war with Mexico, and so they think that if they let Texas become a state, that might start a war. But the other issue is slavery. Texas wants to come in as a slave state. As I said earlier, that was one of the hang-ups between the Mexican government and the Texans, is that they wanted to have slavery. And at this time, basically the way the United States is operating is that for every slave state, there has to be a free state. And so all the southern states are slave states, and there's an equal number of northern states that are free. And this causes a little bit of an issue as you start getting into these western territories, is because it's not always like a north-south kind of a thing. And so what happens is you actually get 2 states in, I believe it was, the dates eluded me. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. You get 2 states that come in as slave states, Texas and Florida. And then, so they have to balance it out. So Iowa, so for us Iowans, we came in as the counterbalance I think we were brought in as the counterbalance to Florida. And then Wisconsin was brought in as the counterbalance to Texas. So they kind of just like kicked that can down the road a little bit farther. Of course, we are inching ever so close to the Civil War, which is going to break out. It actually breaks out about 10 years after Texas becomes a state. But it's, they're trying to hold on to this balance. But the fact is that the people who think that slavery is immoral and wrong, like, can't deal with slavery being a thing. And the people who support slavery just cannot deal with the idea that slavery could be bad. And so their ideologies are so separated from each other that they can't reconcile, and eventually it is going to lead to a civil war. So after Texas comes in and becomes a state, kind of the next thing that happens is our president, James K. Polk, wants to annex California and New Mexico and Arizona and that kind of area. And he offers Mexico $30 million, and Mexico says, no, that's not going to happen. And so what he does is he sends the U.S. military into Texas, and they just so happen to run into some Mexican soldiers, and fighting breaks out. It's kind of in this disputed area of debate about whether or not this is land that belongs to Texas / the United States, or if this is land that belongs to Mexico. But the Mexican soldiers and the American soldiers get into a big fight, and so Polk goes to Congress and he says, "Hey, Mexican soldiers just attacked our men on American land," which is debatable because it was a disputed area. But Congress is like, "Yeah, okay, let's start a war." And this is a very fast war. Most of the Americans who die actually just die of disease. They aren't killed in battle. But eventually, the United States captures Mexico City, and the Mexican government is, basically forced to say, "Okay, we'll accept your bargain." And Polk says, "Okay, we'll give you $15 million, so half the amount that he had previously offered." And in return, the United States gets all of the southwestern states. So we have California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, Wyoming. All of those eventual states, those are all now territory of the United States. So that's kind of that situation. Let's see, what do we have? Yep, so that was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is the treaty that ended the Mexican War, or the war with Mexico. The next thing that happens is or at least in our book here, the next thing that happens is that in 1848, this shiny yellow rock is discovered to be in abundance in California. The gold rush. The reason those of you guys who like football, the San Francisco 49ers, is because in 1849, a whole bunch of people moved out to California very quickly. There were not a lot of people there, and very quickly there were a lot of people there, and they all came out looking for this rock, hoping to strike it rich, and a lot of them did not strike it rich, but they still moved out there, and so California's population grows majorly. This was the gold rush is what it was called. So it's just a bunch of people rushing out to California hoping to find gold. And so you had people who were like panning in the rivers and people who were mining and all sorts of stuff, all looking for gold because, oh my gosh, gold. Let's see. In that year alone, 80,000 people arrived in California from around the world, actually. It wasn't even just Americans, though a lot of them were Americans, of course. There were a lot of Chinese people who came. There were a lot of Native Americans, of course, who were already kind of living there. Americans came, black people came, even some Mexicans came. Like there was a whole lot of people all just kind of rushed to this place looking for this shiny gold rock that we've decided is valuable. So, of course, anybody who is not white is treated very poorly. The Chinese were very discriminated against. Hilariously, the Americans kind of thought that the Chinese were really like backwards and barbarous and all this stuff. To which the Chinese responded of like, we've been civilized and like, had written language and all this stuff when you guys were still like doing, living in huts. Like China has been a civilized nation for a very long time. And it's kind of ironic that the Americans like looked down on them as if they were these like, backwater people, which they were not. But that's kind of just the way it is. Whenever somebody is different than you, people tend to be racist towards them. So there's the gold rush. And then the last little part of this chapter is 1850. There's enough people for California to apply for statehood. And so consequently they did. September 9th, 1850, President Millard Fillmore, who I've read a little bit about him. Millard Fillmore is a very boring president, but this is the one thing that he kind of can hang his hat on, I guess. But he signed a law that made California the 31st state to enter the Union. I believe Iowa's 29. I think Wisconsin was 30, and so California is the next state at 31. California comes into the Union, and they are technically a free state. So they, again, upset the balance. The compromise, which I believe was called the very inventively named was called the Compromise of 1850. It occurred in 1850. There was a bunch of things in there, but basically it was just trying to kick the can down just a little bit farther, just trying to keep that balance between the free states and the slave states, keep the Union together. There's a couple things that came with it. But one of the, I think, kind of interesting ones is that California had to agree when they sent representatives to Congress, they had to send an equal number of pro-slavery and anti-slavery representatives to Congress in order to maintain that balance, because both the slave states and the free states did not want there to be more, say, senators or congressmen who had an opposite ideology, because then all of a sudden, all you need is 50% of the vote. So all of a sudden, if you have, we'll say 100, there weren't 100 senators at the time, but say there's 100 senators, and if 51 of them are supporting anti-slavery laws, then all of a sudden they can start pushing through things like, hey, you can't have slaves for this, you can't do this, you can't do this. So the slave states were super, super sensitive about that. And so even when California was coming in, one of the rules is that they had to send equal representatives because there was no balance to California, and it was looking like there was going to be less and less balance moving forward. So anyway, so that is the end of Unit 5. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. Make sure that you fill out your packet. So Unit 5, Lesson 7 looks like that. And then also do the maps and globe skills, and I'll probably on Seesaw I'll post the answers to these sorts of things, trying to get you guys to go back and forth. Also, I imagine, email your parents the Chapter 5 test, and you guys can take it. We'll see. It won't really be for a grade, because it's not very fair for me to grade you guys on, did you watch a YouTube video, since you don't even have the book. You kind of have to watch this video and do your best to fill out the packet. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Anyway, sorry. I think that's it. So have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.